From A-STAR, Agency for Science, Technology and Research, we are now joined by Professor Teck Seng. He has been doing the research in energy issues, and he was involved in high-level education, and he's going to make a presentation titled Urban Solutions for the Sustainable and Intelligent City, Singapore.
Waseda University for inviting me to give this lecture alongside Professor Kanman and some very distinguished lecturers from Waseda University. It's certainly a privilege for me to be here. But as a beginning to my talk, let me preface it by a comparison between the United States and Singapore. The United States is a huge nation, and Singapore is really a small city-state. If many of you may have been to Singapore, and if you do not know, Waseda University actually has got a small office and outfit in Singapore, which is about 600 meters from my office. And we certainly look forward to more collaborations with them as we proceed on this path to look at viable urban solutions. Singapore is only 720 kilometers, square kilometers, but on this island, we have 5.5 million people. So by any standards, it's a very, very intensive use of land that we see in Singapore. Everybody knows that Singapore advanced tremendously. We have seen tremendous growth over the last 40 years. We became independent in 1965, and since then, we have seen our economy grow, and today, our GDP stands about $300 billion US. And moving forward, we hope to see continuous growth. But the key for any country, and in particular for Singapore, is to see whether we can grow in a sustainable manner. And what we hope to deliver to the citizens of Singapore is not only a sustainable growth, but one that is of quality. So what is quality growth? Quality growth is linked to our ability to use our spaces for the quality of living that we hope would meet the expectations of the citizenry. Population will grow. If population grows, would the comfort of the people still remain at a level that we expect? The social and psychological health of the people. We have an aging population, and in fact, our aging population trajectory is as steep as that of Japan, if not higher. In that case, shouldn't we be looking at how we transform Singapore in the longer term to one that meets the expectation of all ages, from the young to the old, developing a city for all ages? I preface this by saying this because even as we look at this, there are some very basic issues we need to address. We need to look at basic amenities, energy. Now, we started today's meeting looking at energy in a very vertical fashion, and Daniel brought it on a wider scope, looking at the national perspectives and community perspective. We see in Singapore energy being linked to water, and this has been alluded to by Daniel. You cannot delink the two, energy and water. And then there is waste. Obviously, if you're going to look at a zero energy building and a zero energy community, the waste considerations needs to be taken into account. But if you look at this, this is not all to it. There is the input into the system, there's food. Food is a critical element that we need to look at. And then, if you look at all this together, then it provides then what we call the quality of life, the livability, the health systems that needs to be put in place to provide the health care, etc. So this is a bit about Singapore. So Singapore is a city. And as a city, we are in the realms that compares ourselves with Shanghai, Tokyo, going down south to the developing cities of Vietnam, to the cities of Thailand and Indonesia. What is interesting is every city is stressed. More so in some of the developing countries in the world because there's a mass migration of people from rural to urban areas. The rate of migration is incredibly high. 1 million people move from rural areas to urban areas every week in the world. But a huge proportion of this migration is in Asia. So Asian cities, in particular, Chinese cities, will be highly stressed. So Asia's urban population sets a backdrop to what we in Singapore see as a global challenge, which is reflected onto us in Singapore. So if you look at what are the challenges that faces cities, sustainability that we have addressed to some considerable length about clean and cheap energy, growth under land constraints, waste management, city renewal, and then if you look at the security aspects, secure water supply. The stress on cities being able to supply their citizens with clean water is one which is very, very critical. Food supply, food security, food resilience, food integrity, and then of course data security. In this day and age, data is also very critical. Wellness. When you have all these amenities, roof over your head, clothes to wear, we need to provide our citizenry with an uplifting related to social, psychological wellness, living in a garden, urban greenery, public health, and care for the elderly. Then we look towards efficiency in the system so that we have a very, very livable environment. Proximity to services, transportation infrastructures that serves the young, the old, the infirm, ICT and telco services to provide us with the means to make intelligent decisions and well-informed decisions. And finally, demand for personalization. Singapore is not exempt. In fact, we are in the midst of all this. Singapore, noting the density we have to face, is land constrained. Every day we grapple with the decision to make whether we build more schools, give more land for the military to do training, give more land to industries to build factories, or give more land to parks because it provides greenery for people to enjoy. Decisions that are very difficult. Water security is a very important thing for us. 20 years ago, the people that supply us with water, our neighbors, decided that they may not want to supply us with water. If Malaysia stops supplying Singapore with water, Singapore will collapse as a nation. Singapore at that juncture in time decided that we are going to be self-sufficient in water. So we embark on what we call the beginning of our water story, which I'll share with you a little bit later on. But the solution of our water problem is not entirely one which is premised on technology. This, I'm sure, you have realized from what Daniel and our earlier speakers talking about energy. Solving the energy equation and energy problem is not one that is premised only on technology. It's one that needs to be linked to policies, that needs to be linked to social behavior, and linked to how we live our lives. And finally, Singapore being a city-state, being one which is highly advanced, is a very, very bad citizen of the world. We consume a lot of energy, right? So we certainly need to look at energy diversification. But this part of it I don't need to speak about because you have heard all about it from Daniel, right? But I shall share with you a little bit about some of the things we do there which augments what Daniel has talked of, and it's no different except that we do it from Singapore's perspective because we are a small nation. So the Singapore water story. Where does water come from? It comes from the rivers. In many countries, because they've got high mountains, the snow melts, rivers flow, they get the water. Singapore has got no high mountains, right? If you come to Singapore, the highest hill we have, is only a few hundred meters high, right? Probably not as high as the new Tokyo Tower, which is about 640 meters. So our water comes from runoffs, comes from the sea, right? So if we are not to import water, we must use our runoffs. So Singapore has a declared policy of collecting as much runoffs as possible. That means rainfall comes onto the roads, the fields, we want the water to be collected. So if you're going to do that, there needs to be changes in policy about how people build their buildings such that the water is collected, right? So there is one aspect of it. Having collected the water, it needs to be processed, right? Desalination is very costly, but we need to invest in new technology to make it affordable. Then there's a third source of water. So Runoffs, storm water from rain is what we call gray water. So technically, really, if you get water from the storm drains, you take it, it looks gray. That's why you call it gray water, right? But we also process brown water. Brown water is actually sewerage water. So if you go to the sewerage lines and take the water, it's actually brown. So at the end of our journey to become self-sufficient, we invested in technology and we bring in our partners. Who are our partners? The universities, the research institutes, but also the companies. So essentially, a government cannot solve a natural problem by itself. It needs the whole community and the whole ecosystem. So our for water solution and successes requires to look at technology and how this needs to work hand in hand with policy, and policy that stretches from national policies on land use, policies on building structures, and policies linked to pricing, which helps shape consumer behavior. A very big decision we made, apart from the runoffs and the processing of brown water and desalination, was to create a huge reservoir for ourselves from what we thought was initially an impossible solution. If you come to Singapore, as you land, if you look to the east, I think to the west, as it lands in Changi, there is the mouth of the river called the Singapore River going into the city, right? That is actually where the sea meets the Singapore River. And at that juncture where they meet, it is brackish water. Obviously, very difficult process. But we decided to expend billions of dollars to build what we call the Marina Barrage, that interesting green structure you see up there. And there is basically a dam across the whole mouth of the river, and in due course, the water within the barrage becomes fresh water and can be used as what we call our fifth reservoir, right? So what happens? If there's a huge rainfall, a low water comes, will there be a backup of water? If that is so, there is a facility to breathe water out to the sea, right? This also serves as a measure to stop flooding from happening in Singapore when there's high tide and there's a huge rainfall. But it was not an easy decision. We had to solve very, very complex problems, which requires us to do topological modeling, but not only that. Just imagine this barrage in place. Basically, the water behind is still, it's not flowing anymore. So the whole ecology of the river will change. And we need to study the impact on this, on river life, and how it's going to change, and whether this has gross impact on the river life along the whole stretch, which stretches something like 40, 50 miles, right? But we had that in place, we studied it, but not in a siloed fashion. Daniel has stressed about system study. This is a study in complexity, not of one system, of multiple complex systems with fairly interesting dimensional properties that we need to look at, time dimensions, because the time constants of each of these complex systems differs tremendously. So that was the Marina Barrage. The new water we saw behind in the next part of the picture is actually the water that comes from processing sewage. And it is so clean that it can be drunk. But when we produce this new water, our citizens refuse to drink it because they know it comes from basically shit water, you know? So today what we do is we process this water, we pour this into the reservoir, and then it comes out again and everybody drinks it, right? So these are some of the measures we have taken. So what are some of the learning points? Technology is key. Technology is key. But if you look at the ecosystem which supports finally the translation of technology out to industry so that they can produce products and services for the citizens, we need to bring in industry fairly early on. So you see a host of technologies we need to address, right? Which is very interesting, very challenging, and very engaging for our academics, for the partners we have in this water technology. We have partnerships with Europe, with Delft. We have partnerships with US universities. We partner UK universities, right? We partner companies. Toray from Japan was one of our key partners. but it is a partnership because they also do a business of it, right? So for us, we address every part of the value chain and every part of the technology chain, from the collection of water to the processing of water, and finally to the pricing of the water for delivery. Now, pricing in this case was critical. If it's not priced appropriately, the value of water is not necessarily realized. You can have all kinds of propaganda information to the young people, to the old people, to everybody, but pricing is very critical. Pricing ascertains the behavior of industries too, to get them to recycle, because there is a cost-benefit analysis which they do all the time to ensure that they're profitable. As such, when we address a social urban challenge, we think that it must yield economic outcomes. There are clear economic outcomes for us as a nation, but if there are economic outcomes for the company, then we have a clear synergistic relationship which allows us to make sure that the solution is sustainable for the longer term. As such, we bring in main R&D activities through partnership with companies, which includes GE Water, Toray, Nitto Danco, Siemens, a whole host of them, and other supporting companies within the supply chain, and also our academic community and our research community, to ensure that we continue to be able to educate and train young people who can go into this industry, because they are an integral part to the provision of utilities for the survival of the country. Right? So over the years, we have created 11,000 jobs and 1.1 billion of value add to our economy. So there is an economic gain, there is a social gain, right? And there is an industry gain. So in this way, we provide a mechanism to enable us to ensure that this solution and the improvements and advancement of the solutions we need for water continue to move on the right trajectory. So this multi-dimensional approach and requires what we call a trans-institutional approach: supply chain, the supply management policy, the demand management policy, and as well as social outreach, which cannot be underestimated. The social outreach is very critical. A lot of people all around the world take water for granted. We in Singapore do not. And for us, the continuous messaging to young people that this is important continues to be very high on our agenda. And finally, the industry development. Singapore is interesting that, being small, we also provide ourselves as a test bed for new technologies, so that it facilitates the translation of the technologies out to industry. We were talking about smart grids, we were talking about diversification of energy sources. In many countries, you cannot actually experiment with the national grid. In Singapore, that may be a possibility. The water solution tells us we actually use our whole country as a test bed for new technologies to advance solutions for our own survival, right? So we position Singapore as a choice location for testing and demonstrating new technologies and for its translation out to industry. So over the years, 2006 to 2010, we actually hosted 94 test bedding technologies related to water and water solutions. Now, as we look forward, what are some of the challenges we see in Singapore? And this is a list of 7 challenges we see, and it ranges from zero energy, water and waste solutions for a community, to looking at typologies and technologies for creating high livable compact cities. Singapore, 10 years ago, has a population of only 3.4 million. Today, we have a population of 5.5 million. Now, as an absolute increase, it's very small, but as a percentage, it's massive. The impact and the stress it has on our housing and on our transportation system is immense, right? So if you look at transportation, which I'll talk on later, it's not about whether we should shift from internal combustion engine to EVs. The challenge for us is to actually reduce the total number of vehicles on the road. In fact, that would be a much better solution for everybody, right? So the key is, can we convince everyone who wants to drive a Maserati, put it at home, go by train to work, right? Okay? To challenge 3 sustainable transportation system. For us, Singapore is well known to be a garden city. So to continue to keep that greenery, to have that urban biodiversity is continuing to be important. Food resilience and security is key for Singapore. The optimization of space and land use is very, very important for us, right? So if you look at Singapore, our borders are the sea. We do reclaim, but we can only reclaim to a certain extent before our neighbors start complaining, right? So we have a finite area for us to develop ourselves. And finally, the provision of urban services through more intelligent urban systems modeling, right? So as an immediate measure for us in Singapore, there are two very prevailing themes. One is sustainability, which includes, for example, zero energy buildings and communities, and intelligence. Intelligence is very important, and that, of course, comes from our ability to sense and using ICT to be able to collate the data and using data analytics to be able to analyze for trends. What does it do? Intelligence helps consumers make good decisions. Two, intelligence allows the government to make good decisions. It allows the government to come up with policies to shape investment behaviors of companies, for example, or to direct the shaping of the investment policies, not only of the government, but of industries. So intelligence is very important in every aspect. But more importantly, we think that intelligence in its immediacy, helps for us to shape transportation investments as well as use of transport facilities in Singapore, and to support the decisions that have been made to support healthy aging in our community as well as the wellness of our people as we move towards the use of electronic medical records and electronic health records. So a few words about clean energy. As in many countries, clean energy is a key national prerogative. And actually, the driver for this comes right from the very top. The person you see there is the Minister for Finance in Singapore, and he was a chairman of this big committee to look at, our strategies for economic growth. And there was a specific and a particular subcommittee on energy resilience and sustainable growth. And key recommendations are looking at diversification, enhancing infrastructure and systems, increasing energy efficiency, strengthening the green economy, and pricing energy right. So there are two key levers that the government can use. One is policy, and the other one is technology investments. So for us, if you look at Singapore, Singapore imports all its energy. Electricity in Singapore is generated only through gas power stations. Everything is imported. We have a very big carbon footprint, so we are very bad as a world citizen. But if we are going to change, we cannot look at the supply side. We must look particularly at the demand side. We cannot look at the supply side because we don't have wind. We are not going nuclear because we are too small a country, right? We don't have wave energy or tidal energy. We don't really have geothermal, right? The only alternative is solar cells for us, right? Solar PV. Solar thermal is also not a solution for us. So if you look at our situation, obviously we must look at the demand side. Help people be more energy efficient. Like California, can we be much more efficient and be better than everybody else? If the world average or a city average is 100%, we will be operating at 40% as individuals, right? So we must look at the demand side. And that is very critical for us. And some of the initiatives we have include all the things you see there, as well as smart grid. In fact, Singapore has one of the biggest experimental smart grids in the world, right? So that is used for us to simulate all kinds of scenarios that we hope to be able to implement onto the national grid, right? So if we're going to do technology development to support the policy development by the government, we need to have the academics, the scientists, and the companies working on solutions. So we have our Experimental Power Grid Center, which is called EPGC. We have created a clean tech park, which is actually a park for industry, but it is zero energy base. And then, of course, if you link the EPGC which is an experimental grid with a test grid, which is on an island of Singapore, which is one which you can go on to actually put industry-grade equipment to see how it works all together. We actually have very efficient and very good facilities to support industries to look for new solutions for us. But the ecosystem will not be complete if we do not bring the industry together with us to be able to come out with the industry solutions that we can implement. So we look at essentially bringing the industry along with us, both in terms of the manufacturing as well as the placement of the R&D operations in Singapore. Now, interestingly enough, even though we have no onshore or offshore wind in Singapore, we host two of Asia's R&D centers for big companies, Vestas and Gamesa. They have their research center in Singapore. And one of the interesting things that we see them doing is their expansion on development in offshore wind. One of the reasons they are in Singapore is because Singapore hosts two companies, our own companies, which are very, very big in the provision and the development of platforms for oil exploration. 70% of the jack-up rigs and floaters in the world are actually produced by these two Singapore companies. So they work with these two companies to look at the installation as well as the development of offshore wind generation capabilities. Now, I will talk a little bit about food because it's an integral equation to urban sustainability. I thought this would be interesting. The total farming area in Singapore is only 1% of Singapore's land area. And this is only about the size of half of Shibuya district. So that shows you how small we are in Singapore. And they only provide less than 10% of Singapore's food supply. So everything is imported into Singapore. But the key for us is to see whether we can transform ourselves from just a passive food importer to an active contributor to local, regional, and the global food supply chain system. So our intention is then to encourage innovation, and this is basically using the scientific facilities we have within Singapore, working with the companies that see Singapore as a base to do the research and to translate out to the agro-based economies of Asia, which may be in Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, right? But in Singapore, we have an initiative which looks at vertical farming. We don't have land, but we can always farm vertically. So there is a very big initiative in Singapore looking at vertical farming, right? So if you hydroponics, obviously you can have layers and layers and layers and layers forming and going up. So that's one possibility, and this is being investigated and studied in Singapore. And in fact, a certain part of this was actually featured in Dan's Discovery Channel program, right? So I was very surprised to meet him and realize there's actually more things in common between him and me and between him and Singapore. So the view is that whether we can grow Singapore into an agribusiness hub, in so doing, we actually provide a certain resilience for ourselves. And working with the companies producing food outside provide us what we call a forward defense for us to have food integrity in Singapore, right? But transportation is one which is much more closer to our hearts and closer to where you are in Japan and in Tokyo, where, you know, the stress of people using transportation is immense. We have, as I told you earlier, a big increase in the population base, right? Our economy grew tremendously. In the last 10 years, the average growth was about 8%, which is tremendous for us, but it also means there is a stress to our urban systems, right? With increased travel demand due to growing population and limited land for transport infrastructure, we need to think very carefully how we manage it so that it still provides a level of comfort to people, at the same time keeping a clear view of what it's doing to our carbon footprint. So of course we use ICT to do congestion pricing. All our roads are priced. Everywhere you go, you know, you have to pay money. If you go to a more congested area, you pay more. So you decide to go to a less congested area, but it might take you a longer time. So you have to do your cost-benefit analysis. So some of my young people are now beginning to design apps to give you advice on which is the best way to go, right? Now, as a government, we know what is the average speed on every part of our roads because we have sensors on every taxi in Singapore. So my institutes have got actually facilities for us to be able to tell you exactly the speed you can travel on every part of the road, statistically, which is quite accurate because of the number of taxis we have in the system. So we have that in place, right? Is that good enough? As I told you, that goes a long way. If everybody travels at a good speed, there's no traffic jams, the consumption of petroleum or consumption of gasoline reduces. But that is not the most important thing for us. Our ultimate aim is to see whether we can decrease the number of people using their own personal vehicles. But to do so, we need to provide more intelligence to people so that they can make good decisions, right? If I were to take a short drive to a train station, and at that train station, if I arrive at that time, within 2 minutes, a train will arrive and will bring me to my destination in 20 minutes. If I have all those information, I'll be convinced, that that might be the best alternative for me. But Singapore is very warm, so people do not like to walk. So if the provision is such that the drop-off point is so close to a train station which is air-conditioned, so that you are very comfortable from the point you drop off at a train station to the point you enter the office for your meeting, people will be convinced that that is the best way to go to. Now, for us to do this, it means developing Singapore, not only the train transportation system, but it also means developing our building infrastructures with the connectivity with the air-conditioned comfort that must be in place, right? But then, the provision of air conditioning costs energy. So, the total system evaluation must be taken into consideration, right? Before we develop anything. But what is key, we found, is that providing people with more information, more data, more intelligence, provide them better means of making good decisions. And people are rational, and we hope the rational decisions we make will be for the common good. So we have got lots of complaints by people who take buses. They say, why can't we develop a system to tell me when the next bus that I want is going to come? Actually, that is very easy to provide because there's a GPS on every bus. There is a GPS system at your bus stop. You take the 2 points, a simple calculation using any apps will tell you the time is going to come because we know the average speed that vehicles are traveling, right? So we are now getting our Land Transport Authority to put that in place. So that will get the people who are standing at bus stops, a bit more happier. Because people are not unhappy to wait as long as they know how long they have to wait. It's a strange thing. We study that, if they know how long they got to wait, they're happy, But if they're waiting there and not knowing when the bus is coming, they get very angry, right? So for the future, our intent is to be able to evolve a transport system which is people-friendly, people-centric. And what it means that it is one where people will be able to move around comfortably and conveniently, at the same time meet our intention to reduce our carbon loading in our economy, right? So intelligence in decision-making is critical. The type of technologies we put in critical is very critical. And as you see, we do all this together with the companies that are located in Singapore, 3M, IBM. But on the right-hand side, Economic Development Board, the Infocom Development Authority, the Land Transport Authority are all our government agencies. We work together to ensure that we are able to provide the right systems for everybody to use. Now, aging and wellness. If you look at this chart, there is one red line for Germany, and there is a blue line with a dotted dot, which is Singapore, and we are getting there very, very fast. I asked my colleagues who prepared this chart, I said, where's Japan, He said, since you're speaking in Japan, better not to have Japanese curve there, right? They are, I'm sure, very aware of where they are on that trajectory. But this stresses the point that Singapore has got one of the fastest aging population in the world, right? And it is no comfort to us. So what we do is, of course, a burden to government, right? Because old people who don't work don't pay tax. So the key thing is to make older people work for longer. So, when I started working at the university, they told me, oh, Dr. Low, you can retire at 55, you know. I'm already 57. They say, no, now the retirement is 65. So, but it's a good thing because professors always like to go on, you know. So I'm tenured to 65. But 65 is now the new retirement age. But we think that, you know, by the time, you know, I reach 65, the retirement age may be 75 because the life expectancy of Singapore has just increased another 2 years because our environment is good, our healthcare provision is good, so people now live longer, just like in Japan, right? So the key, as I said, is how we going to manage this demographics, right? You know, so aging population increased burden on the healthcare system, of course, because you need to take care of more chronic conditions. There's also rising expectations. We are now a developed country, expectations rise, right? And hence, we need to be more coordinated in the provision of our healthcare and elderly care, right? But Singapore is fairly quick off the mark, right? Sometimes we are a bit behind, you know, in introducing medical health records, electronic medical health records, national health record systems. We are actually a bit slower. But being small, we are quite nimble. And as a country, our ability to put a whole system in place at a national level is very, very, very good, as you can see in most other systems. So we actually have that in place, right? But it's not as easy as that. We have to grapple with differential privacy. Even in a smart grid, you have to handle differential privacy because, you know, you have so many entities, you know, involved. So we think that this is clearly the path to go, but we need to handle some of the sensitivities and the intricacies involved. If we are able to leverage on our ICT solutions, obviously we are able to provide better, devolved healthcare and home care, you know, able to provide more personalization in terms of services to the elderly and the infirm, right, at a lower cost. Singapore currently spends only 4% of our GDP on healthcare. The US spends 16%, right? And for all intents and purposes, according to our colleagues that come from San Diego and Boston, they are able to testify that our healthcare system is as good, if not better, than the US or UK. But we know that we cannot continue spending only 4% because of the demands of this aging population. But we cannot spend more than 6% because if you look at natural budgeting, if you spend 6% or more, then other parts of your country will be stressed. Obviously, education is equally important, right? As education is important, you know, the provision of utilities like water and all this and roads and all this are also important. So there are many demands on your national budget. So for us, we do not intend to spend more than 6%. Maybe 5 years later, we may evaluate again, right? But that's the situation. But the key is that, you know, we need to integrate, you know, ICT into the total system we have such that we are able to provide a better level of healthcare to all our people. So the key for us, again, moving forward, is to promote public-private partnership to accelerate development of solutions for the aging population. We have found that as a government, if we are to develop all the solutions ourselves, it's very slow. So it's just like, you know, the world of Apple, right? If you open up to everyone in the world to develop apps, you've got many apps. And we are of that view too, on bigger systems level. So we bring in partnerships from industry. As an example, we have the Green Building Initiative. And what we do is we give out grants. And we give out grants not to the universities alone or to the research institutes. We say that every research institute or university who wants to work on this type of project and want to apply for grants must work with a company. So what it means is that the speed by which, through which this technology or science they're working on gets translated to industry through the company is much more faster, right? So we are a firm believer of public-private partnerships. So obviously moving ahead, using electronic and ICT means we hope to be more efficient and be able to develop better healthcare to all our people. So you put all this in context, what we are addressing is highly complex system. You know, we have, you look at utilities, gas, energy systems, electricity, water, waste management, the logistics, which is transportation systems. Then we look at the provision of healthcare. And if you layer on top of our national IT system, right, obviously intelligence provides with many attributes. So what we see is that, we see integration of many complex systems. Previously, what we used to do is look at in silos. My public utilities board will only solve the water problem. My national electricity board will solve the electricity problem. But now, we like to look at a more systems level, but not only in particular communities, but we now look at nationwide. That is unique to us in Singapore because we are small. We are no bigger than a city. In fact, we are a very small, we are actually a very small city, for example, compared to San Francisco or LA, right? So we are actually very, very small. So it allows us to look at this in totality, right? So as a system, as an integrated solution for multiple complex systems. So if you look at this too, one of particular great importance to us is actually land use. So the complex interrelations between different land uses is very, very critical. Singapore is a great marine nation. We have shipbuilding, we have rig building, we have a cruise center, we have many demands. All this requires what we call shoreline. But Singapore has got a finite shoreline. So even the shoreline is stressed. So we cannot build, for example, our liquid LNG gas terminal onshore because we don't have a shoreline. So we actually go out to sea and create a floating platform for ourselves, right? So this competing land uses creates a situation where you have to look at it in a much more integrated fashion. So the complexity is not in two-dimensional form, it's actually in a multi-dimensional forms, right? So I'm not going to talk too much about, the complexities and the maths and there's a lot of work which is done at universities in the mathematics and in the area in an area of science that addresses complexity. But we need to understand what we are working with, the planning parameters, the requirements and the challenge statements. If we cannot articulate the problems we are facing, then we will not know how to solve them. And finally, how we gather data and information to help us make decisions to move forward. So just as a final few slides to wrap up, there are a few initiatives in Singapore that actually addresses some of the key concerns we have. There's a research center on energy and environmental sustainability for solutions for megacities, which is being launched, and this is in partnership between the National University and Shanghai Chiao Tung University. This is funded by the National Research Foundation to about 14 or 15 million US dollars. There is a Nanyang University complexity program, and they actually have got Professor Jeffrey West, formerly from Santa Fe Institute, working with them. And there's a complex systems program at A-Star on urban solutions. Now, that program is funded by me, and this actually uses the capabilities within my own institutes as well as the universities and partners we find in the various universities in the world. I fund this to about 30 million US dollars, and we are just beginning to roadmap and to chart the scientific agenda for ourselves moving forward and looking to work with the partners that we are going to bring in. So the partners that we have talked to include Rolls-Royce, EDF, Veolia, Bechtel, GE, Siemens. So most of the big companies will, including Maiden Shah, for example, who is working with us on a smart grid, and many other Japanese companies. So as I conclude, Singapore is actually a living laboratory, right? So if we bring companies together with a lead demand from the government, we can look at new concepts, prototype it, and then we can be the first adopter and as a reference site moving out. So obviously, companies want to serve the global market, but they also serve us in the domestic market to solve our own national problems. Right. Immediately, if you go to Singapore now, there's a new precinct being developed, and it's called Punggol, and we are going to make that an eco-town, right? And the planning, the design, and the urban solutions that we're putting in are one that will meet the highest standards of ecologically friendly cities, right? But it also involves the engagement with the citizenry so that the people who live there are well in tune with what we're trying to achieve and be really the pioneers in this type of living moving forward, right? So it means smart grid, smart meters. These are what they see in the homes, but these are not necessarily the only things we have there. Water smart meters, rainwater harvesting, water quality monitoring, right? Electric vehicles and charging point, e-bicycles, right? But even the lighting. For lighting, we may be working with Philips, for example. When you light up a city or a precinct, it's about having sufficient lighting so that it provides safety for the people using the place. It provides an ambience which is comfortable. But if nobody using their place, then obviously there's possibility to actually have lesser amount or smaller amount of lighting, right? There are also provisions to use the right type of lighting as well as right energy systems to support the lighting system, right? So there are many new things that will be integrated in this Punggol E-Town. But we emphasize this is an eco-town for the tropics. So as you design this for Singapore, it will be very different from what you would design for Japan or the United States, because environmentally it would be different. Our temperature variations is one which only stretches from 24 to 33. We don't go down below 20. I think I've never seen a day, any time of the day, where the temperature in Singapore drops below 21, right? 21 was already a freak, right? So with this I conclude, and I thank you very much for your attention.